send you the recording of this afterwards if you want to, upload it to your website.
Why not?
We'll be able to send you. All right, I think we'll go ahead and get started here. Maybe wait for a few more people to trickle in. Adam, you have the doc I shared you?
Yep.
Okay, cool.
With a little luck, my dog won't bark. If she does, we'll feature her.
Okay, all right. I think we'll go ahead and get started and let some more people trickle in later. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jasper Bors, and I'm the Speakers Director of the Buckley Program at Yale. Also online, we have Adam Rothman, the Social Media Director of the Buckley Program, who's going to be moderating this event alongside me. Welcome to this Zoom lecture titled Digital Cathedrals, the Information Infrastructure Era with Marc Mills of the Manhattan Institute. Before we introduce Mr. Mills formally, I first want to say a few words about the Buckley Program. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, the William F. Buckley Jr. Program is an organization dedicated to promoting intellectual diversity and open political discussion at Yale. We do so in a variety of ways, including hosting lectures, dinner seminars, firing line debates, and an annual conference. Our over 300 Buckley Fellows have a wide range of political beliefs, but they all stand united against intellectual and institutional complacency on campus. By providing Yale students with a forum to engage meaningfully with serious conservative thought, the Buckley Program forwards its mission of a more open and more representative political atmosphere at Yale. Especially at a university where the mission is the cultivation and creation of new knowledge, Buckley Fellows believe that all perspectives, including those of the right, must be heard and examined in good faith. You can learn more about the program and how to become a fellow on our website, buckleyprogram.com. All Yale undergraduate and graduate students are eligible, and if you're a fellow, please share this opportunity with your peers. Now on to Mr. Mills.
It's my pleasure to introduce Mr. Marc Mills. Mr. Mills is a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute and a faculty fellow at Northwestern University's McCormick School of Engineering and Applied Science, where he co-directs an institute on manufacturing science and innovation. He's also a strategic partner with Cottonwood Venture Partners, an energy tech venture fund. And previously, Mills co-founded Digital Power Capital, a boutique venture fund, and was also chairman and CTO of ICX Technologies, helping take it public in 2007. Mills is a regular contributor to Forbes.com and is author of Digital Cathedrals, Work in the Age of Robots, and The Bottomless Well. His articles have been published in the Wall Street Journal, USA Today, and Real Clear. Mills has appeared as a guest on CNN, Fox, NBC, PBS, and The Daily Show with Jon Stewart. In 2016, Mills was named Energy Writer of the Year by the American Energy Society. He has testified before Congress and briefed numerous state public service commissions and legislators. Mills served in the White House Science Office under President Reagan and subsequently provided science and technology policy counsel to numerous private sector firms, the Department of Energy, and US research laboratories. Early in his career, Mills was an experimental physicist and development engineer at Bell Northern Research Labs in Canada, and the RCA David Sarnoff Research Center on microprocessors, fiber optics, missile guidance, where he earned several patents for his work. He holds a degree in physics from Queen's University in Ontario, Canada. It's actually where I'm zooming in from today. We will allot the first 20 minutes this afternoon for Mr. Mills to present. And from there, we'll move right into questions from the moderators as well as the audience. If you wish to ask a question, please submit it in writing using the Q&A feature on Zoom. We'll do our best to end this event at 5:30 p.m. So with that, please join me in warmly welcoming Marc Mills to the Buckley Program.
And thank you. And thanks for inviting me the program and everyone for listening. Let me share my screen. And as you mentioned, what I'll do here is go through a few slides to provide everyone sort of a high-level overview of what I mean by digital cathedrals and what's going on in that world. So you can see the slides now, I assume?
Yep.
So first, let me explain the title and what I mean by digital cathedrals. You know, for those of you who know a little bit of your history, and if you don't, you might know this anyway, the era of the great cathedral construction in Europe was an era of incredible economic growth and technological development. And the construction of the great cathedrals was made possible by the technology and the wealth of that era. Setting aside why they were built, of course they were churches, but the physical capabilities and the economic wealth at the time is what made them possible. And the people that built them, the masons, were revered, the buildings were revered, the whole infrastructure that the cathedrals represented became sort of epicenters of commerce in every village where they were built. In our era, we have our own cathedrals. These are digital cathedrals, they're data centers. They're in a sort of interesting way, we kind of revere and admire the digital masons that build these things, the companies that have them. And they're made possible similarly by a lot of money, by wealth of our era, and the technology of our era. So it may seem like a loose analogy, but it's actually a very valid analogy in terms of the technological nature of the two times, and of course the structure of economies that occurred 500 years ago and today. And in fact, I would argue, and I will be arguing in my next book, that the technological revolution that we're experiencing today has only happened a couple times in comparable ways in history. Once was at the time of the great cathedrals, and the second was, of course, the Industrial Revolution you've all heard a lot about and read about. So let's talk more specifically about what's going on. The digital cathedrals are, of course, the data centers. They're the infrastructure of the internet and then some. That's the infrastructure that makes possible what we're doing right now. It's what probably all of you have been doing for classes for quite a few months now with telecommuting. 10, 20 years ago, it would have been essentially impossible for 30 to 40 million people to telecommute, which is what's happened in the last few months, and to do it at all much less effectively. There's a theme which we're happy to talk about with everybody, and I'll come back to briefly, that's running around the sort of the punditocracy these days, is that we're seeing the end of the age of the office, maybe the end of the age of the university. I don't think that's true. We can talk about why, but right now, I'll just throw up a few facts for you before we get into the infrastructure of the internet and the cloud. This is a survey taken of tech companies. Up top left, you see the Bye Office. About a week ago, about 800 tech companies were surveyed and asked this question, you know, if you were offered the opportunity to work from home and not go back to the office, would you do it? And you can see here, 57% said they haven't been given the offer, but if they did, they'd take it. So the assumption in a lot of the punditocracy is that this means there's no more offices. Let me just point out a couple statistical facts that are sort of a reality check. This is a survey of tech workers. The whole information community comprises about 7% of the workforce, that all forms of the information community, which includes, by the way, Hollywood and making digital movies and games. So when 7% of the workforce, 60% of the 7% say they work from home instead of go back to an office, it's meaningful, but it's not a profound change in the structure of our economy. In fact, the graph you see in the bottom left is the share of American workers who work full-time at home, not work occasionally at home. You do some work from home. This is, the Commerce Department has been tracking this data for a long time, actually since before the year 2000. And right before the shutdown hit from the coronavirus, the total percentage of the US population that worked full-time from home was still under 6%. The fact that a lot more than that did it temporarily is important, it's meaningful, but the data on the right is a new Bureau of Labor Statistics study that last month looked at the question of what jobs could be done from home. And this is not counting the number of jobs, this is the percentage. You can see the obvious, right? Information-centric jobs, 80% of them can be done from home. We'll call them atom-centric jobs, things that involve doing things other than information. Maybe 5 to 10% of those jobs can be done remotely. But that shouldn't be surprising when you think about it. But that asymmetry actually has both technical and political implications. Could you make more of those jobs that are like the transportation and warehousing done remotely? Yeah, in theory. You have robo trucks, right, instead of truck drivers. I mean, you know the answers, but they aren't here today. And the fact that they aren't has both technical and political implications. But back to the infrastructure. All that's made possible by the fact that we've invested an enormous, by we, I mean the private sector, not the public sector. We've invested an enormous amount of money in building out information infrastructure. This is a graph of the annual US spending, capital spending, since the year 2000 in 4 categories. And you can see an information equipment category conflates both enterprise software and enterprise hardware. The reason I've conflated enterprise software and hardware is you can't run enterprise software unless it's on enterprise hardware. Software doesn't run in a cloud like you see in the sky. It runs in a cloud that's a data center. So the spending there, which is a cumulative spending of something on the order of 50 trillion rather dollars over the last 20 years, is an enormous amount of money that's been put into the infrastructure to manage data. That's why you keep hearing this expression, sort of data is the new oil. Obviously, data is not an energy source, it's an information source. So the idea rhetorically makes some sense. What's different about data than oil or any physical resource is that we create data. We don't have to find it, we create it. We create it by measuring things and then processing the data. That shows up as internet traffic or data traffic. Interesting sort of fact point for you is just maybe again, it's not surprising, but data traffic has increased some 10 million fold since the dawn of the internet in the mid 90s. Yet measured in any realistic terms, less than 20% of our economy, of the GDP, is actually digitalized. The digitalized portions of our economy are dominantly the information-centric parts: entertainment, news, finance, and so forth. And artificial intelligence, AI, is still in very early days, and that will make a difference, as I'll talk about. We begin to digitalize things. And before talking about the future, let's do a little bit more on where we are in this infrastructure, because the physical size of this infrastructure is meaningful in many ways. It's meaningful in terms of where the money has gone. It's meaningful in terms of illustrating that society has built not only an unusual infrastructure that's never existed before, the information infrastructure, but it's arguably the biggest infrastructure we've ever built, and we've just begun to build it. One way to analogize the data center infrastructure and all of its pieces might be with skyscrapers. I'm choosing skyscrapers because data centers are big buildings. They're basically office centers, vertical office centers. Data centers are big buildings. They typically are only 1 story high, but some are several stories high. But the data centers, it's calling these data centers that word is like calling a skyscraper an office center. They're clearly different things when you go to these scales. If you look at the square feet of each of these buildings, what you'd find is that the 10 biggest skyscrapers in the world collectively have less square footage than the 10 biggest data centers. There are about 1,500 skyscrapers in the world, so the Empire State class buildings, that kind of building. But there are 5,000 enterprise class data centers that are sort of, we'll call them Empire State class buildings in terms of their square footage. And there's about 1 million more data centers that exist that are smaller than that. That would be, if you're using the real estate analogy still, like shopping malls, if you like. The interesting thing about data centers is that we're building them out at a hell of a pace, far faster than we were building out skyscrapers. And from a physical infrastructure perspective, and from an economics perspective, if you're in the business, let's say, of investing in REITs that relate to office space and REITs that relate to data centers, costs about the same to build a skyscraper as a data center in dollars per square foot. Kind of interesting. You can rent a square feet of data center for about 5 times more than you can rent a square feet of a skyscraper. And if you're interested in the energy costs of infrastructure, which matter, powering a data center uses about 100 times more energy per square foot than a skyscraper does. So if you had a map of just the United States, these maps you can get online of where all the enterprise data centers are. Unsurprisingly, they're all over the place, right? They're not only all over the place because they need to be often close to where business is transacting, because speed of light's actually not fast enough to move certain classes of data from a data center to a user. They're all over the place, also often for economic and power access reasons. You want cheap power. The global construction of data centers took off roughly right after the recession, the last recession ended. We're now in another recession. If I were to plot this graph, you see a global construction starts in millions of square feet for 2020. It's probably going to be down 10 or 20%, not as much as you'd think, because, well, for example, right now we're Zooming. That requires data centers, requires networks and devices. So you can see this bullet below, I'm pointing out that the data centers, while they're the cathedrals, if you like, of the information infrastructure, you have to access the information that's in the cathedral, so to speak. You have to send information to them. So we have edge devices, we have edge data centers, and of course we have the telecommunications networks, wired and wireless, that connect everything, and the manufacturing system that has to build all this unique hardware. It's an ecosystem that is unprecedented, frankly, in history. And in fact, it's an ecosystem that, well, I'll put it in these terms. The cloud ecosystem, broadly speaking, that's the data centers and the networks, the things on your desktop and your hands. That whole ecosystem uses more electricity than the country of Japan does for all purposes. Or put differently, every square foot of those data centers, and that graph shows you data centers being built. These are not existing, this is built, but in millions of square feet. 10 square feet of a data center uses more electricity than a Tesla running flat out 24/7. Or in global terms, the world's cloud today uses 30 times more electricity than all the 5 million electric vehicles that exist in the world. But the point of that is not that it's good or bad, it's just a fact. It illustrates the magnitude of this infrastructure. It's an infrastructure that's used to generate information, to control things, to inform people, to answer questions. And what that should do is increase productivity of our society. Well, it has, but it's increased the productivity mainly in the parts of the economy that have been digitalized, which are the digital industries themselves, the finance industry, the entertainment industry, the news industry. Those industries have been heavily digitalized. They become far more productive, as this graph shows. This is a measurement of value added per employee, normalized to the year 2000. And there's been some improvement in the productivity of the physical industries, manufacturing and transportation, because information does matter there. Simplistically, scheduling things, Uberizing things, if you like. The surprising, and maybe not surprising, depends on how much you know about this, the surprising or unsurprising trend in healthcare industries is that there's been no increase in productivity despite the digital age over the last 15 to 20 years. If you extend this graph out for the data through 2017, which is the most recent data that's available, the trends look the same. So what will matter for the future for our economy is if we can get more productivity in healthcare. You understand what productivity means. Productivity is getting more value out per dollar in, whatever the inputs are. And the reason healthcare is expensive is that to get more of it, we have to spend more money. If you want to get more of it by not spending a proportional increase of money, you need productivity. That productivity is going to come dominantly from digital systems and information systems and AI. So if you look at forecasts for the traffic on this information infrastructure, and the traffic in the information infrastructure is like traffic in physical infrastructure. We measure road miles or ton miles in the physical transportation system, we measure air miles in the air transportation system. We measure bits, obviously, bytes in the digital and information system. And we measure them in zettabytes now. It's a very big number, as some of you may know. It's an incomprehensibly big number, in fact, but set aside how big the number is, what you can see is despite the fact that we've had this roughly 5 million fold increase in data traffic since the dawn of the internet, we're still in early days increases in data traffic for all these principal purposes. Entertainment is obvious. Business pixels, you can imagine what that we mean by that. That's the generation of video for business purposes, for industrial purposes, for safety purposes, for training, for inspection. And of course, productivity data, broadly speaking, is all in the service and the industrial sectors. The measure here that matters is not bytes, it's how much money you spend to do something with this infrastructure. The thing that you do is perform a calculation, in effect. The calculations are the computers solving a problem, answering a question, or directing a truck, if it's a autonomous truck in a mine. In 1960, this infrastructure allowed you to get one calculation per second for every dollar you would spend. By the year 2000, you could get 10,000 calculations per second for a dollar. Today, you can get 1 billion calculations per second for a constant dollar. This is the most remarkable increase in productivity of a tool that's ever occurred in human history. It is a phenomenon of unprecedented proportions, all made possible by this infrastructure. A few more factoids for you. So the part of the infrastructure that's different going forward from the past is the expansion of these data centers to what's called the edge. That just literally means instead of a 1 million square foot data center that's bigger than a Walmart, remotely located, say 20 miles from downtown, we have small or micro data centers increasingly being built closer to buildings and offices. That's happening partly for security reasons. Partly it's being driven by the physics fact I mentioned earlier. Speed of light's not fast enough to control physical systems. You have to, let's use an obvious example of automation in a factory. If you have a machine you're controlling, you're using enterprise software in the cloud, the control of the machine has to happen in real time and in milliseconds. It takes more than those few milliseconds for the data to leave the factory, go to a remote data center, say 200 miles away, and come back. It takes too long, and the machine can actually either have an error or hurt somebody in that length of time. So the data centers are increasingly built in complement on the edge. That edge boom is going on at the same time as the core boom. And it's a massive boom, by the way. If you measure it in power terms, it constitutes gigawatts of capacity. A single gigawatt, as you I'm sure know, is the size of a big nuclear plant. And in dollar terms, we're talking about a cumulative investment of another 150 to 200 billion dollars in the coming 4 or 5 years. So the future is going to be in the things you've been reading a lot about, right? There's going to be not just the zooming and streaming video, but that's a lot more of that. There's going to be a lot more things that are digitalized. We're going to be creating digital traffic, doing analytics in the cloud for a lot of things. Hyper-personalized medical diagnostics. Well, that's pretty obvious in the age of COVID that everybody would love to have a smartphone app that would tell them something about the physical condition, ideally. And there are, as you may know, a few prototypes of self-administered saliva-based tests that you can use your smartphone for to do the diagnostics remotely, but take the sample yourself using your smartphone with a plug-in. This would be revolutionary in personal diagnostics. It will use a lot of data, a lot of traffic. You know a lot about VR and augmented reality. Industry 4.0 is next generation industrial controls, along with 3D printers. Connected cars are not self-driving cars, although they could be. Connected cars are the fact that cars are connected to networks now. Most cars are to the internet, as you know, if you've been in one in the last few years. And increasingly, it's not just the audio or video or your communications that's connected, it's the physical part of the car that's connected in real time. By that I mean the status of the brakes, the status of the engine. It's not just about the location of the vehicle, it's about the operation of the vehicle. Bioelectronics, and you'll see I put in edible computers. By that I mean the advent, and this is not science fiction, of diagnostic systems and sensors, literally smart computers that are biologically consumable. You could eat a pill that contains essentially a smart sensor that can communicate with your smartphone and tell you something useful about your body. And in effect, before long, you'll be able to eat a computer a day rather than a vitamin a day. Those technologies are not theoretical. Many of the necessary components have passed FDA clearance, and we'll see a whole new industry in bioelectronics, wearable electronics, and literally edible electronics or implantable electronics. Digital twins Some of you may know what that means. If you have a mechanical system and you want to know how it's operating compared to how it should operate, you create in a computer its digital twin, and it operates in real time along with the real thing. They're connected on networks so that you can compare whether or not the machine, the car, the aircraft is behaving properly. It might have a failure coming. You can even do that in theory, and there's a large global project underway for human beings called the virtual physiological human, where you're in the future, it's not unimaginable that your operating system, your body, your biological system would have a digital twin that would take information from your edible computers and keep track of your health for you personally, and help in diagnosis and also in medical treatment. That's a long way in the future, but when it does happen, the data demands for that are off the chart. And of course, robots. The picture on the bottom right is a robot that Ford is working on, that unfolds itself in the back of a van and carries a package up to a door. It's not practical quite yet, but it's not impossible. Let me end with one more slide, sort of connecting the present to our physical world, not to the future world. One of the other things that the cyber physical universe we have, the new information infrastructure, has done, is everybody knows, is we now have a lot of e-commerce. E-commerce still comprises roughly 11% of all commerce. So we have a long way to go before e-commerce is dominant, but even at 11%, it's disrupted the whole commerce market. And of course, one of the key features of e-commerce in the convenience is, one click, 1 day or 2 day delivery. That has a spillover effect. And you probably know this, but the spillover effect is to increase warehouse construction where these products can be distributed and increase freight movements, trucks. And if you map the two together, this is the truck tonnage index for the United States from 2000, normalized against the construction each year of net additional warehouse space. You'll find ever since the introduction of essentially the smartphone, when the iPhone was introduced and e-commerce started to take off, you find a one-to-one correlation and an enormous and unprecedented increase in the amount of warehouses that have been built and used and the number of trucks that are moving stuff to people. So that gives you sort of a high level. Let me give the screen back to our hosts and moderators, and I'll stop there.
Great, thank you, Mr. Mills. I think we'll start with a couple questions from Jasper and I, and then move on to ones from the audience. So to begin, I wanted to ask Mr. Mills, you mentioned about the incredible scale of energy that's consumed by these data centers that are, really the foundation of the internet. And I wanted to ask a bit about how we think about the environmental impact of that. And, in one sense, people that are no longer commuting to work may think about the environmental benefits, but if we're on Zoom all day and these are being run by data centers that are consuming massive amounts of energy, it may not be as what we think it is. But despite all that, the major cloud computing players, Google, Amazon, Microsoft, are all claiming to be carbon neutral.
Right.
Despite that, these data centers are actually not running on renewables. They're connected to the normal grid using lots of fossil fuels, but they say in all their advertisements that they're carbon neutral. So I want to ask, how is that possible? What's allowing them to make those claims?
Well, so a good question and accurate observations. First, let's deal with facts, and then we can then talk about what companies like to say or how they want to say things. Roughly speaking, it depends where you are in the world, depends what kind of compute you have, what kind of connections you have. There's a lot of variability in these real numbers, but roughly speaking, an hour on video. So for each person watching this, every hour they are on this live streaming video, they're using about the same amount of energy as if they took a 10-mile round trip on a subway or a bus to go to work. But differently, if you're Zooming instead of walking to class, you're actually using more energy because the infrastructure that's behind the whole system that makes this possible, not just the data centers, but the networks themselves. In fact, the networks themselves, by the way, use more energy than the data centers, surprisingly to most people. Cell towers, wireless connections are energy intensive. But all told, an hour of video is like, 10 miles of a commute on a bus or train, or, a couple miles of driving in your car. So it adds up because that's for each person. It's not for the whole Zoom system. It's for each person on the Zoom system, or each person watching a Netflix video, or each person watching Amazon Prime, or each person when they're doing their FaceTime video. So those numbers are just deducible facts based on what the physics of energy transport and information transport is. So insofar as what companies claim, and you're right, so data centers and especially the communication systems are connected to the grid. They don't have to be in theory. You could make your own power, but they're all connected to the grid. So the electricity that's being used is the electricity that happens to be on the grid wherever the data center is or wherever the cell towers are. So that could mean that if it's in some parts of the country, it might be using 50% coal. In some parts of the country, 50% hydropower. Some parts of the country or world, all hydropower. But on average, it's using the same energy forms that the grid has. So in the United States, the average of the whole US grid is about 9% wind and solar. The rest is hydrocarbons and hydropower and nuclear power. So that's what the average is. Depends on where you live, but roughly speaking, the averages are what matter because electricity is like money. It's fungible. Once it's on the grid, you can't tell where the electrons came from. Globally, because the numbers I throw out on the cloud are global numbers, we know what the global numbers are. I mean, global electricity from wind and solar combined are roughly 3%, so 3 or 4%. So how do companies like Google and Facebook and Amazon make claims that they're carbon neutral? Well, what they do is they buy offsets, and we all know how offsets work. In fact, I believe it's about 70% of all of the capital to build wind farms in Europe in the last 5 years have come from US tech companies. So a US tech company that pays to build a wind farm in Europe, and they do it there because the subsidies are generous, so you're getting a good return on your investment, perfectly reasonable. And then what you say is, well, my data center uses a kilowatt hour here, I take credit for the kilowatt hour wind power in Germany. I mean, it's like buying offsets if you fly in an airplane. The problem is once you go that route, you're still asking for your data center to be powered by whatever's on that grid. As a practical matter, they're being powered not by wind power in America, except certain times of the day in certain states. The problem with the assertion that we can do that in effect forever is that you then have to compare globally the percentage of electricity that's being used by the cloud with the percentage of electricity that's being provided by wind and solar, and what that will be in the future. At the current time, the optimistic growth rate in new wind and solar is slower than the actual growth rate in demand from digital systems. So in effect, all the tech companies could buy all the world's credits for wind and solar. It wouldn't be enough to offset all the cloud's energy use, but they would consume all the credits for wind and solar. Is that good or bad? I mean, I think it's slightly disingenuous to say that we're carbon neutral without explaining it. To be fair, as you probably know, if you go to the Google website, for example, the Microsoft website, they do explain what I just said. Microsoft one is particularly good. For those of you who are interested in this, I recommend going to Microsoft made a climate pledge back in January and published on their website. And I think you can just find it by Googling Microsoft climate pledge. A very long essay on energy and energy realities. And if you go to the end of it, you'll find the statement that what I just said, in effect, that they're buying offsets, but they also state at the Microsoft website that they don't expect that there are any technologies available today that will make it possible to have a completely carbon-free grid or even a significantly carbon-free grid for a very long time, that the technologies don't exist, which is why they and Jeff Bezos are funding future research. That's a long answer to your question. It's a really important one because it's, people have the impression that this is all somehow a free lunch. It's not a free lunch, right? Not only is it not a free lunch, but the wind turbines and solar arrays are made from materials that are mined with oil burning trucks. A battery, when it's made in a Tesla, uses 100 barrels of oil equivalent of energy to make 1 barrel of oil equivalent of storage capability. All these things in the physics world are very real and unavoidable.
Yeah, so one of my questions about this whole subject, in recent days and weeks, there's been a pretty strong backlash against apps like TikTok, which are turning out to be platforms for the Chinese government to sort of infiltrate American networks. and the networks of other countries. And I know India today announced they're banning some number of apps from soldiers' phones. The American government kind of took a similar step.
Right.
And all this kind of seems to point in a direction towards an internet that's far more nationalized and separated along national lines, which is something that had already been going on prior to this whole TikTok controversy with, China having its own platforms for social media and Russia being able to shut down its internet, Iran being able to, kind of have similar capabilities. Do you think that that's kind of the future? Are we going to have, are we going to have to make treaties between countries over internet and data usage? Or is the utopian promise of the internet still alive?
Well, utopia never existed. I'm writing another book, but in the book I went and did the research. I probably should have known this. When the book Utopia was first written, and of course it was written as an attack on the idea that you could ever have a utopia. But I digress. There is no utopia. The dream that the internet would be always a extra national free platform where you could do what you want, say what you want, independent of governments, was always a myth, right? So our internet was created initially as a government communications platform, and then privatized in effect. The telephone system is always had a lot of government involvement, telecommunications. But I think you articulated correctly. What will happen because of how important the cloud is, the internet is that it will be increasingly nationalized because people will have different standards. Let's say what we would consider illegitimate standards. Some countries like Iran and China want to heavily censor their people. Others have different tax laws or different privacy laws in Europe than we have. So what will happen, I think, is inevitably the equivalent of how we handle international air travel. Right? We have very different laws about how we tax and subsidize and what we do about airplanes and runways and how we fund them in our country compared to, say, Qatar. But we have global engineering standards and regulations that allow us to share. We can fly to other airspaces safely, right, with radar, and we have a common standards for commerce. I think increasingly that is almost certainly going to happen with the internet, that we'll have common standards for communications of a lot of things, and some things will be very hard to integrate, and some of them might be in commerce. It might be difficult. I think it's naive to think that won't happen, but I think the fact that we'll have more complexity in how you can communicate with somebody in another country, some of that complexity would in fact be solved by the software itself. So you could imagine the complexity means there's so many different rules, but as long as those rules are digitalized and I know what they are, I can create an AI engine that will simply intermediate, right, for me what I can do and I can't, and tell me what's allowed or not. And yeah, it means that people in China don't have freedom to listen to us, for example, talking right now necessarily, but that's been true for a long time.
Yeah, thank you.
So one of the questions from the audience is interested in what's phrased as an assumption that productivity and digitization are positively tied. And to expand on that question a little bit, this is an ongoing debate. On one end, you have people like Andrew Yang, the former Democratic Party candidate, whose claim is that digitization is going to happen across the economy, every job from trucks to lawyers, and his solution was universal basic income. But on the other side, we have people that say the productivity from digitization is not there. People like Peter Thiel that said, we're promised flying cars and we got 140 characters. And there's a growing people that are kind of skeptical of that. Have we really seen this incredible progress across the world? Or is it just in that world of bits? So yes, that's a broad question, but in general, do you see this as in that spectrum between Yang and Thiel? Where do you fall on this being a time of historic progress?
Well, I think they're both wrong. I don't know Thiel. I've met Yang, and he and I have debated before in his pre-political days. So here's what's wrong with the construct. First, you have to decide what we think about productivity and why, what it is and why it matters. So we have to define it properly. But human beings have always wanted to do whatever we do more productively. And that's how we live better, because we use less of our time and physical resources to survive, create food, fuel, the essentials to have survival and shelter. So there was a time through most of history that 80% to 90% of all GDPs were used, all the economy was used to get food, fuel, and transport and shelter. So very little of the economy was available to most people to do other things, entertainment, education. So the only thing that changed was we had more productivity. So a question that's sort of on the table is, A, do we have more productivity from digitalization and software? Yes or no, right? That's the second question is, if we get a lot more of it, is it dystopian? Does it mean the end of work and every truck driver's out of work? And so first, the critics are right, because that's why I showed that graph. We have no productivity gain in healthcare. I mean, if we measure it the way that matters, right? Dollars into outputs being, there are standard ways you measure outputs. You can look across time, whether you agree with them as the right measure. In cars, it's easy. How many cars do you make an hour? In healthcare, it's a little more complicated. But we don't have much productivity gain in healthcare in the last 20 years. Had a lot of productivity gain in advertising, right? I mean, that's epic. It's cheap to advertise on YouTube compared to on network television 20 years ago. So that criticism is correct. That's why my point is we're early in the digital era. And Peter Thiel's right. We haven't digitalized most things. But the analogy, which I love, it's great. We were promised flying cars and we get, 100. I think Twitter's up to 300 characters now, isn't it? Am I right? So they upped it. But anyway,
yeah,
that's a category error. Flying is a physics problem. It's not an information problem. You need a material science change to make flying cars. You can navigate them better with digital stuff, but you have to have a material science change to make flying cars lighter and more powerful. You need better batteries if you're going to be battery powered, better motors. That's all in the engineering physics, not in the information domains. So they're bad analogies. But I would say that the information systems have gotten so powerful that exascale class computers are getting good enough now that we are already seeing evidence that we can engineer better material things, better, lighter materials, new classes of materials, new classes of batteries, new classes of engines and propulsion. So as that happens, and it's just beginning to happen, because computers weren't powerful enough for that. It takes astounding computing power to do that. We'll begin to see the digital effects in those domains. We're in the early days of that. We've had sort of this interregnum, that is, we had all this productivity gain for 50 years, from World War II to 2000. Then it slowed down. That's because we squeezed all the gains out of the old technologies, if you like. The digital stuff took off in the information space, made that more efficient. Didn't do any bupkis for most. There's no self-driving cars yet. We think self-driving cars will be more productive. Yeah, they would, because you could do other stuff while you're driving. But it's hard to do. It turns out it was overpromised. Doesn't mean it's not coming. And when it does come, it's fundamentally more productive, because while you're in a car, you can do something. A lot of people would choose to do something other than drive when they're commuting. They might like driving for entertainment, but driving for commuting is work. And so why not let a robot do the work? Not a bad idea. It just turns out it's harder. So I think Thiel got that part right. We were overpromised, because it actually is harder. But the overpromising came from media and pundits. Didn't come from the engineers. If you read the technical literature, which I do as well, they didn't promise this would happen soon or easy, but it's coming now. So it's a nice tension, but it's actually a tension reflecting the interregnum we're in. We haven't got the productivity gains we'd like in other areas yet. That's coming.
An audience member just wants to clarify what the definition of an enterprise data center is, as opposed to a regular data center.
Well, there's a lot of soft definitions. So we have now hyperscale data centers, which are the really big ones. But enterprise data center typically means that's you may or may not own it. The ownership, we'll set that aside, is a remote building that is not physically on your campus or your university or on the campus of your business, that you keep the data and the software resides in, and you access it remotely. You could have an on-site data center, which is not typically an enterprise data center. And those exist when you care about security, physical security of it, and even some forms of cybersecurity, because you air gap them if you're in the, say, the military or hyper-secure industries. You don't connect them to the internet. So you have a data center that's isolated, air-gapped. So typically that's what people in the enterprise means. Another business owns it like Amazon or, Digital Realty Trust or other types of co-location companies. And they're typically far away from where you are, tens of miles, hundreds of miles, could be thousands of miles away. If you want to do cold storage of cat videos, you don't have to have real-time access to that. You could put that on an Arctic Circle data center that's cooled by, cold water and run by hydro dams in northern Norway.
We have another audience question on the topic of cybersecurity. So is security, both physically and data-wise, evolving appropriately to the increasing volume of data traffic and increasing amounts of data centers?
No, that's a good question. I think we're starting to take it seriously enough. I've said, and it's been said, and I think it's not an unfair thing to say, that most of the coders, most of the people that write code to do things in Silicon Valley really don't care about cybersecurity. They just want to get the app or software out fast. And the security feature of it only rises up if the client, right, demands it up front. But if the goal is to get the software out fast, to make it do something from delivering pizza to, being facetious only in part, to doing facial recognition, you want to get that code to work and the app to go, and you push it out. And the security is secondary. The problem with security is it's hard, just literally hard in every technical sense, physical and virtual. Another problem with it is it has its own overhead. It slows software down. I mean, let's use the obvious example. I bet everybody on this call has had to use two-factor authentication or three-factor authentication. Right? You want to access your bank account, you have two-factor authentication. Thank goodness, it makes it harder for bad guys to steal your money, right? You really want three-factor authentication, but that takes time. And every time your bank asks you to redo it, it not only adds time for you personally, but the computing side of it, the overhead and the computing side consumes compute resources to make that possible. So if you want things to happen fast and seamlessly with the least amount of compute resources consumed, by that means, flops or even literally energy, you sort of don't push hard on security. I think it's most people take it seriously now. Certainly businesses do, and I think we've entered a new era of sort of hyper awareness of security. I mean, obviously in the political realm, we've had a lot of attention paid to WikiLeaks, Russia's hacking, China hacking. You can be sure that China, Iran, and Russia all have interest in disrupting and hacking our political discourse, all of them. Forget who's running for president today or in the past or the future. Of course they do. And they've been doing that for years, and they'll keep doing it. So security matters. Knowing if people are messing with us matters. So both the forensics, did somebody hack me, right, is important, as can I make it so they can't do it to me? It's the expression, it's a Sisyphean battle. You never win it, but you can keep ahead of it with a reasonable amount of effort. We're starting to spend the effort both in dollar terms and in technical terms.
Another audience member just wants to clarify why bytes are used sometimes as a measure of digital productivity.
Why bytes are used as a measure of digital productivity? Well, they're not so much, we measure bytes on the traffic, and sort of the assumption is, right, if you see a correlation as you have more traffic measured in bytes or bits, which is, they're essentially the same thing, but not technically not identical. You expect they're being done for a reason. I mean, if you think about it this way, we have more traffic measured in bytes to do video and to watch internet streaming movies. Used to be you could get a DVD sent to you. Same bytes. There was no internet traffic when the bytes were mailed to you as a DVD. Now I'm putting those bytes streaming on the network. I'm measuring that. Is that more productive? Yeah, probably it is, because that's why it's taken off. It's more productive in a sense, more movies for less dollars, right? There's certainly more people watching movies for fewer dollars spent than ever in history. So that is that's the definition of productive. But in business domain, no business buys a robot or invests in AI except if they think it's productive. By definition, the investment is done because they've been convinced that the software expense will yield more output in dollars or whatever the physical measure is, usually it's dollars. That means it's more productive. If they didn't believe that, they wouldn't do it. So their act of doing that, the way they measure the business decision to invest in software that gives them more productive business, whatever the business is in the traffic. So it's a one-to-one correlation, right? It doesn't measure the amount of productivity gain, but it measures the act of chasing productivity.
So I'm going to ask you to put on your investor hat for a minute here and ask, what areas of science and technology do you think are the most underrated right now? If there are any entrepreneurial students on the call, what sort of company should they start to get your attention?
Well, we could, so if I had a lawyer on my shoulder, and I'm a physicist, not a lawyer, they'd be saying that my investment advice would be taken with a grain of salt. But you would put it in two buckets, right? There's the domains that are obvious, that people think are overinvested. Let's use examples like Amazon, Intel, NVIDIA, and Microsoft, all of the hot tech companies. Are they overvalued? If it's an investor, it'd be the first question you're asked if you're a retail investor or a hedge fund investor. To answer that question, you have to have some vision of the future, right? So if you accept my vision of the future, the growth has only just begun, then this is the equivalent of investing in General Motors in 1925, 1920, or Ford in 1920. That Ford had been around for a while at that point. It was a very successful company. You would have made a lot of money investing in Ford in 1905 and selling in 1920. You would have made more money investing in Ford in 1920 and selling in 1950, right? Because that's when they were already growing, but they boomed from there. I think that it's 1920 for tech. So if you think the tech that was ascendant in the last century really was the transportation infrastructure. It was cars, planes, trains, and automobiles, right? Mostly planes and automobiles. That infrastructure started to take off in the 20s. The first commercial air flight was in the 20s. The first really useful car was in the 1920s, right? Car ownership took off then. But cars have been around at that point for 35 or 40 years. Computers have been around for 35 or 40 years. Data centers have been around for 25, 30 years. So why now? Because it's just taken off. So I think that domain is what, let's call it, safe, in the sense that the big guys, if they're not crooks, and I don't think they are, but if they don't commit antitrust acts and get broken up and all these things, they're not trivial, will grow, and they're good investments. Other side of it is, and I'm talking about public equities, not the private equity side. On the public side are things that people underrate, or don't want to invest in today because they think it's passé, right? A good example would be oil, right? People think we're not going to need oil in the future. There are those who say that. Well, maybe in 50 or 100 years, could be, but in timeframes that matter for investors, the oil market and its digitalization is underinvested. So if you're looking at plays that are out of fashion and that are not going away, because world commerce is not going away. When we finally get out of the COVID times and we have commerce returning to the normal pace, then the world's been through bad times before. 98.5% of all global transportation is oil fired. Right? It just is. As fast as electric cars can be built, they're not going to replace ships or airplanes. They'll replace cars. And even as fast as they get built, we're still going to have 80 or 90% of cars powered by oil a decade from now. If oil is undervalued today and you can digitalize it, maybe it's a play. Where that would be specifically, what companies, is a different issue. The third feature, of course, is in the private equity side, which is not available to most public equity investors. But there, I would say the same metrics apply. Technologies that are relevant to Amazon, Microsoft, technologies that they would buy, you would invest in them. A lot of VC funds do. But equally the case, the out of favor domains that don't go away are in effect the best buys, but they're, they have other characters or risks attached to them, right? So you're balancing different kinds of risk. So I think if I were being simplistic, old energy technologies are underappreciated. Everybody knows there's going to be more windmills, more batteries, and solar arrays in the future. Like, that's a no duh. Of course there'll be more. No matter what the politics are, there'll be more because they're better. But that's a heavily recognized, almost overinvested idea. The idea that there won't be more use of oil or gas is an underinvested idea, and it's not going to go away. So there's an opportunity across this entire spectrum. The core feature of everything, I think, is going to be that almost everything that's relevant to the existing tech players and to the non-digitalized sectors is going to be focused on enterprise class software, obviously, because the cloud is what's driving the software utility, where you use the software in the cloud because it can be upgraded more easily, it's faster, and so on. That's the thread that runs through everything. So if I were looking as an investor, I'd want to see whether the company is playing to that macro, as they put it, right? If they're not playing to that macro, then they're probably not going to be a growth play.
So one of my questions is kind of related to this idea that increasingly it seems like the major technology companies, at least in the United States, are becoming more competent in some ways at just doing things than the federal government. Especially I think.
Go ahead.
Especially I think in the coronavirus, when we've essentially basically become so dependent on Zoom for all sorts of functions related to work or social gatherings, that kind of thing. So it sort of seems like the reason that they're successful where the federal government is not is that they have like a teleology, right? It's to make profits. So I'm wondering, what sorts of institutions, governmental or corporate or global, are going to need to be strengthened or rebuilt in order to channel or redirect technology towards socially productive ends?
Well, the tension between what government tries to accomplish as representatives of everybody, because that's what government's supposed to do. Right? It's not supposed to represent. In elections, we have a constituency, but once we get through an election, most people believe that the government's job is to help society at large and represent everybody. And there's always been a tension between when a government entity does something and doesn't do it efficiently versus the private entity is doing that something more efficiently. The private entities have a profit incentive, and the profit incentive has benefits, right? It focuses the mind. You can't make something work unless you can make a profit, because you can't make a profit, you can't pay employees. It's a positive loop or a negative loop, right? Depending on which way you go on your profits. Governments are not driven by profit metric, and they can't be, and they shouldn't be, right? They're, to your point, driven by social metrics. But governments always count on the private sector to do the thing. So the quintessential thing governments do is defend our country, right? They build war machines and defense machines. But there's no government entity that builds those machines. The private sector builds those machines under contract with the government. So the same is true in the tech space. The private sector, the tech companies, are under contract to the government to do things for the government. The extent to which the government wants to achieve an output, let's say, more effectively do testing for viruses, right? The tests are done on machines invented and built by private companies. Now, the law that tells you what they can test, how they can test, right? The regulatory laws around HIPAA and the regulatory laws around healthcare determine the constraints in which those machines can be used, but they're built by the private sector. They're typically operated by the private sector. You can nationalize things to say, we're going to just do it ourselves. We think we can do it better. But typically, this is the debate that matters the most over time. This is not a new problem. We had the same thing, the dawn of the car age, the dawn of the air age, the dawn of electrification, the dawn of telecommunications. The same debates were going on then as we're having today. And the essence of the debate distills to what's the model of government that can use the innovation that comes out of the private sector, and let's call it the efficiencies of the private sector, but control without too heavy a hand so that they stay efficient and innovative, right? It's not that they shouldn't have controls and boundaries. It's when do you cross the line and you actually crush innovation, or you crush the ability for business to function. And that's the tension that goes on all the time. And we're having that debate again, to your point. It's why you're asking the question. We looked at how this was handled, and you think, man, we didn't do such a great job. Let me recommend an article to you and in the audience, your friends. There's in the New Atlantis, and you know that magazine, the New Atlantis. the last issue of the New Atlantis, and I believe the article is available online. I think it's in the online New Atlantis. There's an excellent analysis of the difference between the US response to the coronavirus and testing here and in Germany. And the thesis is that Germany did better than us. They did do better than us in testing because they had a centralized government approach and we didn't. It's actually not true. The inverse is true. They had a decentralized approach to testing with the German states, and we had a centralized control, which was less effective. The article, I'm biased here, the article was written by one of my sons, Tony Mills. So if you Google up Tony Mills New Atlantis, Germany coronavirus, you'll find the piece. I told him this is extraordinarily well. He's at R Street, by the way, the think tank. It's a really good analysis with citations on exactly to your point that you have this incredible innovation and you can use these tools, these tech tools to help, both biological tech tools and information tech tools. And it went better in Germany. You'd want to know why, right? And you read this and you realize, well, it went better because they actually did what we claim we did. We didn't do what we claimed. They sort of decentralized the testing. So the lesson you would take from this is let's follow the German model in that sense, which the tech companies I think would embrace, frankly. And I think most citizens would, but not everybody, because it's like everything in our time, especially in this year, it's political. So the politics will come into it.
Yeah, well, this has been a really great discussion. I think we're going to have to end it here at 5:30. Thank you so much for joining us, Mr. Mills. Yeah, we really we're grateful to be able to have you.
Thanks for having me. I enjoyed it. Hope you all got some ideas out of this that might be useful in your pursuits.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you to all the audience members for joining us this evening. And definitely stay tuned for future Buckley programming this summer. All right, take care.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.